Warm greetings and namaste. My name is Resh Ramasamy. Thank you to the National Council for Physical Education of the Philippines for inviting me to speak in this conference as a keynote speaker. I feel thrilled and privileged to be here today. Please allow me to illuminate on my positionality. I am a proud, colored, autistic, queer, academic, and scholar. Some of my credentials are as follows. I am a university lecturer and tutor working at the Australian College of Applied Professions, formerly known as the Australian College of Applied Psychology, in the discipline of counselling. I'm a senior developmental educator, lead therapist, and specialist support coordinator, working closely with disabled people and their families. Given I'm autistic and being disabled is inherently me, I've opted to use identity-first linguistic prescription when describing on my disabled equals. I'm also an active peer reviewer and published author, and I'm affiliated with the Global Forum for Teacher Educators as a distinguished honorary professor, a frequent international keynote speaker, and collaborator. My talk today will focus on inclusive research and its relevance and place within the broader contours of conventional research, community, and spaces. I'll provide you a quick overview on the concept of inclusive research, and I then plan on engaging with you for further dialogue over Zoom. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting and recording this presentation today. I recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and the community. In specific, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So let's look at this concept of what exactly is inclusive research. The term inclusive research can be found prominently in the field of disability research and in the work of Walmsley and Johnson, 2003. And Walmsley and Johnson use this term to embrace a range of research approaches and designs that traditionally have been termed as action, emancipatory, and participatory research. Inclusive research can be useful and can be considered as research that changes the dynamic between research, researchers, and the people who are being researched and serving as research subjects. It is conceived as research with, by, or sometimes for them, in contrast to research on them. Inclusive research shares common ground with qualitative research approaches more widely, particularly the concern with grounding research in the experiences and views of participants. This quote by Kate Holmes, I feel, really encapsulates inclusive research in its entirety. One important way to change invisibility is to seek out the perspectives of people who are or risk being the most excluded by a solution. Often the people who carry the greatest burden of exclusion also have the greatest insight into how to shift design towards inclusion. a powerful sentiment by Kate. And this sentiment resonates with me as an autistic disabled scholar and researcher, because in order for us to understand participants' voices and to privilege their voices, we need to work with them, not for them. As the sentiment in this PowerPoint slide articulates, nothing about us without us. And that captures the essence of inclusive research. So how do we conduct inclusive research? Please allow me to talk to you about some distinguishing features that encapsulates inclusive research in application. The research problem or the research consideration is owned by the research subjects, which means the research problem or the research consideration is informed and it's guided by the participants themselves, who are the research subjects. And one of the central tenets of inclusive research is that participants themselves have an interest in engaging in the research for various purposes, which I will share shortly with you. But one of the most common purpose is to feel emancipated, to feel liberated, but most importantly, to share their voices, to feel privileged in an unprivileged atmosphere. It should be collaborative. And this involves participants in the process of doing the research and accessing and representing their views and experiences in a way that sanctions and affirms and validates their lived experiences and told stories. Within inclusive research, one of the most distinguishing feature that has received, I would say, plentiful prominence is that within inclusive research, participants should have a degree of control over the process and outcomes that are being summoned by the researcher and the research process itself. And the most fundamental element of inclusive research is that the research process must be accessible to participants across all levels of the research engagement. So in terms of why inclusive research, so we've looked briefly at what exactly is inclusive research and how inclusive research, but now why inclusive research? So inclusive research must be relevant to the people concerned. It must matter to them and benefit them and represent their views and experiences. And they treat them with respect. So one of the things I've found from my research practices as an inclusive researcher is how do we deploy or create new hegemonies? How do we construct new knowledge when we are permeated or surrounded by dated, dominant discourses that privilege normative ideals? How do we engage with people who are customarily sidestepped and not given a voice or a platform to share their narrative? And how do we use that subdued or subjugated narratives to create new knowledge in the way of new hegemonies or alternative hegemonies? As I mentioned to you all before, it gives a voice to those oppressed and sidestepped. And by giving people a voice to share their insights and to be guided by them on their told narratives, on their shared stories, we are undoubtedly directly and or indirectly leveraging their social standing and social positioning to be seen as valued members of society. Customarily, most research practices or researchers don't place that value on participants. Researchers come from a place of expertise, or in fact, they might even wear the expert hat. And I would argue in this regard, in the sense that the expert is not the researcher. The expert is the participants who are telling their stories, who are living their experiences, who are engaging in their sense of reality. So inclusive research really understands this notion of expert, and it comes from participants who are the experts, who are then guiding the researcher and the research process, which in turn also it gives them a much more heightened or accentuated social positioning within society. And one of the biggest things, we researchers, I think, fail to understand is, having a doctorate or becoming a researcher or being a published author means nothing if you fail to understand your moral obligations. Okay, researchers have a moral responsibility to provide meaningful and accessible opportunities for people who are often sidestepped and not considered to share their views and or to direct the research process. And what we fail to understand is, by including participants who are fundamentally oppressed or sidestepped, we are doing some amazing things to them. We are changing their lives. We're improving their quality of life. Inclusion in research can itself be a tool or a proxy to promote a better quality of life and to create new, inspired, re-authored meanings for some of the participants who are often neglected and not even considered as equal citizens within society. And as I mentioned to you earlier on as well, it becomes a privilege when we start to engage with participants who are not sharing their told stories. We start to shift the discourse and to create new ways of thinking and doing, and in fact, to diversify knowledge. And that is the essence of research practices. A good researcher will want to understand multiple variations of reality and different perspectives, not just fixate or preoccupy themselves in a myopic stance. And one of the other things to also consider is that the research experience itself can have a very powerful and emancipatory effect on participants. They feel liberated and sanctioned and validated to be given an opportunity to share their narrative. Please allow me to talk about two types of forms of inclusive research. Let's talk about briefly on participatory research. Kansian in 1989 considered participatory research as involving democratic relationships to produce knowledge which incorporates participants' everyday knowledge and to solve problems. It indicates that people being researched are who are participating, and that the participation is comprehensively across the multiple stages of the research process or endeavor. And PR, for short, stresses the involvement in the process of doing the research rather merely providing data for it. And this is echoed by many inclusive researchers. So PR prioritizes co-constructing research through partnerships and collaboration between researchers and participants, stakeholders, community members, or others with insider knowledge and lived experiences. And that's the most powerful sentence or statement or word: insider knowledge. We want to engage with people who have that insider knowledge, that insider experiences. Simply put, PR engages those who are not necessarily trained in research, but belong to or represent the interest of the people who are the focus of the research endeavor. And instead of the subjects of traditional research, participatory research collaborates with the stakeholders, the community partnerships, and the end users in the research process or endeavor. In terms of emancipatory research is a research perspective of producing knowledge that can be of benefit to disadvantaged people. It is typically used as an umbrella term that can include many streams of critical theory that is based on research such as feminist theories, disability studies, race and gender theories. One of the key assumptions in emancipatory research, or ER, is that there are multiple realities and that research is not only created by the dominant and elite researcher. Quite powerful there. And this type of design, it shifts the voices of the underprivileged to a privileged position. And in fact, and this is what I talked about earlier on, but the creation or the summoning of new or alternative hegemonies or constructions of knowledge. And the main epistemological position or assumption of ER is that there is an interactive or reciprocal link between the researcher and the participant. Now, ER is one approach to research inquiry that minimizes the potential for those who are minimized or minoritized and researched to remain voiceless or marginalized. And this form of inquiry, shall I say, requires or renders a high degree of transparency that is not often required or evident in other forms of more traditional or conventional research inquiry. Let's talk now about some practical solutions on how we could deploy inclusive research. Plan for inclusion. I can't stress this enough. Planning for any types of support or assistance for inclusion in research should be the first part of any inclusive project. For example, individuals who are disabled, who are amongst the research target population, should be consulted in the planning process or phases to identify what kinds of needs should be addressed. And this will actually enable the researchers to identify and respond to specific needs of the people whom they are wanting to include or engage with in the research process. And one of the things that I found useful as an insider research or an inclusive research is having a panel of experts. And experts are not academics who have doctorate degrees, but the way I see experts are people who have the lived experiences of the studied phenomenon. So for example, my research, which I'm currently doing, looks at the lived experiences of autistic and queer people across their lifespan. And I've got two experts in my study that share the same identifiers as participants. Okay, it's really important that we use the word expert in a different way when we think of inclusive research. You can be an expert if you are a researcher who also shares the insider status with participants. And that's also fine. Like in my case, as an autistic, colored, and queer person, I also share the insider status with participants, which helps to build mutuality, shared understanding, and a huge degree of trust. And one of the ways of including participants in the research to support more inclusion is the form of co-researching, where the researcher or the research process plays an active role in engaging with participants in understanding what is required in the research inputs, the research outputs, and the research process itself. So here are some examples I've just given you on things that we could do to make the research more inclusive in nature. Access is a huge thing for inclusive research. Researchers planning for inclusive research needs to ensure that the process or the engagement is going to be accessible in nature, especially to people who they wish to engage or interview. And these can include things such as communication skills or style, information equity or information accessibility, transport, and even the venues for the interviews. So for example, when I did my research looking at autistic people, some of the things I had to consider was things like sensory sensitivities and how participants would negotiate and navigate all those different stimuli in the environment to not overwhelm them or burden them. I also considered things like, giving participants the interview questions in advance. Therefore, they have a lot more structure and predictability, and also offering options for further follow-ups if required, and also giving participants the opportunity to tell me what sorts of foods they like to eat or drink prior to the face-to-face interviews. These sorts of things makes participants feel a lot more empowered, okay, and included as well, because you are canvassing and capturing their perspectives, and they feel heard and they feel included and embraced. A huge one is language and etiquette. Now, this includes what type of language is appropriate or what types of terminology is appropriate in the research process or endeavor. For example, within my research practice, looking at disabled people, one of the things that I had to really understand is the use of two different styles of communication, which is person first versus identity first linguistic prescription. For example, some participants like to be identified or addressed as autistic people, and others like to be addressed as people with autism. And it's no different to disabled people or people with disabilities. So therefore, when talking or when engaging with people, you need to understand what sorts of things are important to them in the way they identify themselves and in the way they enact their self-identification. For example, if you were to research queer people, one of the things to understand is the use of the proper pronouns like he, they, she, okay, and using, either gender neutral pronouns or as preferred by the participants, okay, or as asserted by them. So it's really important that we ask participants directly, or we talk to those experts who have that insider knowledge, okay, to help us to craft a more respectful, constructive, and inclusive way of communication. And the last one is awareness. Okay, this might seem common sense to most of us, but in fact, I've seen some poor research and poor researchers that don't understand awareness and its importance in research practices. It's important for researchers to ensure that they and any of their research partnerships, it could be their supervisors or staff or research assistants, have sound understanding and sufficient level of awareness when undertaking inclusive research. Those sorts of things can either make it or break it. Okay, so we need to understand when we are embarking on an inclusive research landscape, there might be things we might not be aware of. So before we embark in that research endeavor, go and learn about that process, what's involved. Go and learn about the people who you intend on researching about. You gain some awareness. It's really important as inclusive researchers that we have some expertise, not being an expert, but expertise or some knowledge in terms of awareness, understanding, to build that reciprocal shared understanding. Because at the end of the day, as an inclusive researcher, what's really important is how do we engage with participants on their level, and how do we attribute their mental states? It's never about you as a researcher, but it's about them and it's about we. So in my research, there's a clear principle that guides my practices in research, which is research with and not research for. Working in collaboration, not working in isolation. And these beautiful concepts are nested within a person-centered ideology where you're working with the person and not for the person. And this in turn, helps you to think about inclusive research and the participants as research subjects, not research objects. Therefore, participants will naturally be subjectified through the process and not objectified. I will now stop here and would like to explore this discussion further with you over Zoom and find ways to engage and brainstorm some innovative ways to engage with those marginalized, oppressed, and sidestepped. Thank you for your time, everyone, and for devoting your energies in this beautiful space. I wish you all love, light, and peace. Stay blessed.